Remember me? Obviously it's been a little bit of a while since the last video that I did. Afraid the real world job got a little bit busy. Then I found myself sort of embroiled in some projects and I simply didn't have time to really make videos. Nevertheless, I have been recording stuff, so I thought it was high time that I actually put something together. So you may remember this mask from way back, actually in sort of September 2023, I think was the original video I posted on it. And I started making this directly after the Steampunk festival in Lincoln that I attend, the Asylum. And I just wanted to sort of harness the creative energy that you tend to come away from the festival with. As you see so many cool costumes up there, it always gets the imagination firing and sort of gives you some creative energy to actually build stuff. So I thought I'd harness that and start building something straight away after the festival last year. Now I got this in a fairly complete state, as you may remember, but it wasn't completely finished. So in this video I'm going to go through the last few bits of this helmet. I've also made some additional bits for the costume, and I've also got some footage from the festival itself. So let's get started. So this is where we got to in the previous video, and it's in a fairly complete state, but there are some details to finish, chief of which is really to give it a paint job. So well, fortunately with this one, there's quite a lot of hardware on it, so it took quite a while for me to pull all the bits of metal off this just so I could get the shell clear, so I could actually give it a coat of paint. So what I'm doing is just using some car spray paint here. This stuff's fairly durable, so I use this quite a lot. I'm just giving it a brown coat, and I'm shading it very slightly with some black as well. And I'm going to do the back of the mask in black, just to give it a bit of a contrast. A lot of the colour and sort of detail this will come from the hardware, so I'm not worrying too much about the colours here. Right, so there we go, not looking too bad. So I'm just reattaching all the hardware here. Now the eyes are one section which I haven't completed, and I'm learning from previous experience with some of my previous masks in doing this. So what I'm doing is to put some sunglass type material, some sort of silver foil in between two pieces of glass here, and that will just allow me to see out, but my eyes won't be visible. Now the key thing I wanted to retain with this was actually the ability to have some peripheral vision. Previous masks that I've done have sort of cut off the sides of your vision, and it's only until you lose that you realise how important that actually is, particularly in a crowded event. If you can't see to the sides, then you're very likely to bump into people, and some areas of Lincoln when the festival is held are very, very busy. There's a market square which there's a lot of people in. So what I've done is to put some mesh in the sides of these eyepieces, and that actually serves two purposes. It lets some airflow in, so when the fans are on, it's actually sucking air in through those mesh areas, and that's actually quite nice because you get a bit of a breeze over your face, helps cool you down. But secondly, of course, you can see through the mesh, so it allows you to have that peripheral vision and see where you're going. Now of course with this one you can actually take the faceplate off, which is something you couldn't do in some of my previous masks, at least not very easily. And that actually proved to be really, really useful, because if I was in a situation where I couldn't see where I was going, or I wanted to talk to someone, I could just quickly take the faceplate off, and that was nice and easy. And here's a bit of a test fitting, which is working pretty well, but as you can obviously see my neck and hair hanging down here, so what I need is a leather collar on this. I didn't video this simply because I'm not much of a sewer, so I was kind of figuring this out as I went along. But what I've done here is to sew up some thin leather to make a neck section. What I've also done is to extend that leather up into the inside of the mask. I needed some padding, so I've lined the inside with the same leather, and the way I did that was to make a pattern in tape, so I had the basic shape. I then cut that into sections and then sew those pieces of leather together.
Now, some other details that I needed to finish off with the air intakes at the top of the mask that sit just above my forehead. And for these, I was going to do these in brass, but it turned out to be quite difficult to actually get that shaped, and I was worrying that there wouldn't be enough space due to the thickness of the brass that I had. So what I ended up doing actually was to use some mesh and just some styrene plastic to create a sort of an intake. So this is what I came up with, and I'm quite happy with that. You may also notice that I ended up reducing this section which originally covered my nose and mouth, so the fans in the sections on the at the bottom of the mask would actually pull my breath out so it wouldn't fill the rest of the mask. In the end, I figured that probably wasn't too necessary because I had some fans which were sucking air in from the top of the mask. I figured anything that I breathed out would be dealt with by those. And I also have some fans in these metal sections around the mouth, and so they help to circulate air through the mask. One's an intake, one's an outtake, so the idea is that it would circulate fresh air past my mouth, and so as I'm breathing it would also vent my breath out. And this actually worked pretty well. I had a few instances where I didn't turn the fans on, and I found that the mask very quickly got hot and I found it difficult breathing. So that was a very good example to show that fans are absolutely necessary in this sort of thing, and they really did the trick. On the back of the mask I also needed to do some detailing, so all I've done is to bend some aluminium mesh. I just bent those around paint pots. It's very easy to bend as long as you can find one with the correct diameter, and they just sit in the apertures I created around the fans quite comfortably. So I was anticipating having to do something quite complicated to have these meshes stay in place, but actually that turned out to be very, very easy. I've also dressed the mechanical parts with some airbrush hoses and some brass fittings. I think they look really, really nice as well. I've also got a found object here. This is actually a volume controller, but it's a little bit retro. I got it from a shop in Lincoln which sells retro electronics, and I thought that looked quite nice there, so I thought I'll put that in place. All of this cabling detail allows me to actually hide the real electronics, and so what I've done is to feed some power cables down one of the airbrush tubes, and that terminates in a USB connector. So all of the electronics in the mask, all the fans were run from a USB power bank. Because the current draw from the fans isn't that high, that thing ran the fans all weekend with absolutely no dramas whatsoever, and in fact the charge indicator on the power bank didn't even seem to have dropped anything by the end of the weekend. So if you're going to run any electronics in a costume, a USB power bank really does seem to be the way to go. So that was really, really good. Now, something that I was worrying about once I'd actually put the mask together was the weight of the thing. I'd included things like the cupboard door hinge on the front of the mask and lots of metal pieces and some brass panels on there, and all of these things add to the weight of it. So by the time I was finished, this thing was weighing about 2.5 kilos, and I was quite worried that it would really start hurting my neck after wearing it for an extended period. So for a while I was considering putting these cupboard door closers on the mask. These are essentially pistons, and what you can do is to drill a hole in them and let the air out, and then they'll just function as pistons. What I was intending to do would be to put some springs around the arms there so that they can compress very slightly, but there would be enough force to sort of take some of the weight off my head, and I was going to have a framework around my shoulders that these things would attach to, and that would then allow the weight to be distributed over my shoulders rather than being solely on my neck. I actually quite like the look of them as well. I thought they were quite a cool mechanical detail to add to the mask. In the end, I decided to chance it and didn't worry about them in the end. And actually, it turned out okay. Although my neck felt a little bit sore, I suppose, by the end of it, but not by much. So it actually turned out that the weight was quite bearable. And actually, although I was anticipating only wearing the mask perhaps on the Saturday, it was actually turned out to be one of the more comfortable costumes that I've made. So in the end, I ended up wearing it for most of the festival. So that was really nice. So something that I haven't done quite so much of, but I wanted to do with this, was to actually develop this into an entire costume. I have a tendency just to make a gadget for the festival and then incorporate into the existing pieces that I have. But what I wanted to do for this one was to have a costume for the whole piece. So to that end, I bought a leather coat off eBay with the intention of modifying it with some leather and steampunk items to make it a bit more steampunky. So what I'm doing here is just trying to plan out how that's going to look in paper before I start cutting out pieces of leather. And I want to have this sort of high collar type thing with a sort of a spine of detail down the back. I also have an armoured arm as well. And the reason I'm doing this is because I found in previous years that I would have sort of armour pieces and gauntlets and things that I'd wear independently, but that meant that it was actually really difficult to get them off if you were just going to go and have lunch or something. You'd have to sort of take each one off individually, undo the straps and all that sort of thing. And that was sort of getting a little bit tricky, and it was often uncomfortable. But one year I actually attached a few bits to a coat, and what that meant was that when you take the coat off, they go with it, and that suddenly became really, really comfortable to wear because you could just take that one item off and suddenly you were unencumbered. So I wanted to do that in this case and have a steampunk coat which had all of the bits that I would normally wear attached to it, so I could just take the whole thing off very easily, and that would be very, very comfortable to wear. So what I'm doing here is just cutting out some leather pieces, and I'm dyeing them and detailing them in order to glue them to the coat. Now, I've done some videos on this process in the past, so if you want to know a bit more about this, check out some of my previous videos. But all I'm doing is wetting the leather and cutting in some detail with a thick needle, and I'm using some leather stamps to add some additional detail to it. Now, what I wanted to do for this was to actually sculpt up some details to add to the leather. And I've used cold casting before, and that's the process of mixing brass powder into resin to create brass effect pieces. But I didn't have time to fully sculpt up something in a lot of detail, and purely by coincidence I bought these picture frames from eBay, and you can buy these quite cheaply. I was going to use them for another project, but as you can see they've got this really cool sculptural detail on them. So I thought, well, that's a quick way of getting some really nice detail into a piece without expending too much effort. So what I did was to sculpt up some creatures, some sort of like Cthulhu type designs over the frames, and then I was able to make molds of the frames and then cold cast them up, and they came out really, really well. So this is what I've got. Like I said, I've covered this before, but in brief, what you do is you put some brass powder into your mold, you then mix the brass powder with the resin, pour that in, and once that's dry you can then polish it up to a really convincing brass finish. So these look quite convincingly like brass, but they're actually resin. They're also much lighter than real brass would be as well, so that's quite a nice way of creating some detail for this quite quickly. So I've done a few versions here, and as you can see that's looking quite nice. And as I've said, I've got a nice amount of sculptural detail there without making too much effort. Now I've got this large section at the back which I also want to fill. So what I did was to go on eBay and look for filigree detail which is intended for furniture, and I was able to buy these. Now what these are, they appear to be casts of wooden originals, I think, so you can see some wood grain in the resin copy. So these took a little bit of cleanup to get ready, but what I did again was to sculpt over these and then to make a mould and cold cast up some casts with some Cthulhu and sort of skull detail on them. And so that's what I ended up with. So I think that's looking pretty cool. I really like the designs, and like I said, that was quite a quick way of doing that. And because I already had the moulds, I was able to make some copies, and so I used those for these pieces of shin armour. I've had a go at making this sort of thing before, but I never sort of made a proper leather version, so I really put a lot of time and effort into these, just because I wanted them to last, something I can use for future events. And I've just decorated these with some additional casts of the cold cast pieces I made for the coat. And finally was this gun. Now this is something I actually started making several years previously. I always shied away from guns because I didn't want to get arrested for having like an imitation firearm, but actually guns are pretty ubiquitous at the festival, and there's never any problems with the police or anything like that. People expect to see futuristic sci-fi weapons at the festival, so it's not a problem. So I wanted to actually have a go, so it's not something I've really done previously. So to that end I started putting this together, and the intention of it was that it should be made entirely more or less out of metal. You can sort of go two ways with sort of steampunk weapons. One way is to like get an existing weapon or maybe objects, put them together in the form that you want, and then to paint it up to try and make it look realistic. Now that's good in one way because it will be light and you don't have to expend so much effort in making something from scratch. The problem with that though is that paint effects are never that convincing. I mean, they can look good, but they'll never look exactly like the real materials. So in this case I wanted to make it entirely out of metal. if you do paint up like a Nerf gun or something, you'll never get the convincing weight of a firearm. You know, firearms obviously made of metal, and so they've got a bit of weight to them. So making this out of real materials sort of gives it a degree of authenticity simply by the feel of it. So to that end, I started machining some brass pieces and bought some metal bits from eBay and started trying to piece this together. And I sort of lost my way a little bit with it, so it sort of sat on a shelf for a year or two. But I thought I could return to it for this costume. So what I've done is address this with various bits of found objects, so some coils from tattoo machines there, for example, and a few other bits and pieces. And just sort of pieced this together, and I'm quite pleased with how this came out. I think it looks pretty cool. So that was a decent prop to have with the costume. So there we go. So there's a few images from the festival of me just marching about on the weekend, and I'm really happy with this actually. I think previously I've just sort of had a collection of props and things which I've sort of thrown in a suitcase. So each festival I'll just sort of put out bits that I want to wear for the particular event that we're going to, and I'll piece a costume together for that. But this is the first time I've actually sort of built a costume together and made pieces specifically for it. But I'm quite happy with that. You know, it's something I can definitely wear at future festivals, things like that. So so that's come out pretty well. So I think that's it for this one. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.